Good morning everyone, Exploration Botanicals here. We're doing a quick tip video today. We're going to be doing repotting, so I want to show you how to take a plant you buy from the store that come like this, and I'm going to show you how to make them into something like this. I don't live somewhere where I can plant in the ground, nor do I live somewhere where I can create indoor growing spaces outside. So I'm stuck with what I call guerrilla gardening, or gardening in creative ways and using as many different pots and as much as I can. So I want to show you the tips that I've learned about growing in pots and things that I've noticed compared to growing just straight up into the ground or even normal beds. Pots, they have different aspects to them when it comes to the interaction of soil maturing and becoming what you could call a natural soil system. Obviously pots don't really have that same type of characteristics as the ground because they are isolated environments. So they're not gonna have worms in them usually. They're not gonna have a whole insect biome. They're not gonna have fungi growing in them. So there's a lot of things in pots technically that we're missing to provide a plant with the natural ultimate resources that it needs to grow and do very well. But what we can do is we can encourage some of those natural processes to occur in the soil, and we can also do other things to fortify the plant and to make sure that it has what it needs during the growing season. So we're going to do 4 plants today, real simple. We got Ibici eggplant, we have sweet pepper, we have begonia, and we have cilantro we're going to repot. And you're only going to need, for my mix, 3 things. You're going to need organic peat moss, perlite, and you're going to need an organic fertilizer. Also, Epsom salt is recommended for this. I think it's a great micronutrient to add in when you're potting and also throughout your growing season. So we're going to start looking at the plants and start talking about the pots.
Alright, so before we get started repotting, I want to talk about the actual pots themselves. So size-wise, when we're talking about pots, guys, we're going to be using 2 different sizes, but we're going to talk about 3 different sizes. So the 2 sizes we're going to be using are these small 6-inch pots, and then we're also going to be using these large 15-inch pots. I do want to talk about the fact that these are transitioning pots. I only use the 6-inch to, let's say, take a newly bought plant like this small cilantro, which is going to go in one of these 6 inches, and we put it in there, let the root mass mature in this size pot, let it fully colonize, get nice solid roots, then we'll transfer it to a bigger pot. Plants just seem to do better when you incrementally move them up in pot size rather than putting this small cilantro in this 15-inch. It wouldn't fill this pot out correctly in the end. Now, mind you, there are certain plants like tomatoes, eggplants, pepper, any really fruit-bearing plant that's going to have, get bushy and have stuff hanging off of it isn't going to be very you can't transplant it very easily. So you don't want to plant those plants into their final pot size to begin with. So, we're going to have, our sweet bell pepper here, and we got our nice 15-inch size pot, and it's going to go in there very nicely. And you can see that for the size pot that this pepper comes in, it's really not too much smaller than this 15-inch. It's going to fit in there very nicely and work out great. Like I said, we also have that cilantro, and then we have this begonia. This begonia will be going in a 6-inch pot. Now, besides the size of the pot, mind you guys, I don't grow anything, maturity-wise, small cell goes 12 inches, okay? 15 inches is what I'd say is the standard for anything fruit-bearing: tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, squash, cucumber, anything you're growing of that nature. 12 inches is going to be good for leafy greens, kale, lettuce, maybe some onion or garlic. I wouldn't use a pot like this though. I'll show you other pots you could use in the future for that. Color-wise on the pots, it doesn't really matter too much, but you're going to want something that is darker usually because A, it's not going to fade, and then also it will help absorb the warmth of the sunlight, transfer that to your roots. Like I was saying, pots are an artificial environment for the plant, and they're also isolated. So different things that you can do to give the plant an edge to help it grow in comparison with a plant that was in the ground will help it a lot. So having warm roots is one of those things that we can actually do to artificially increase the growth. It helps the transfer of water to the roots when it's a bit warmer. So the other thing too is that obviously you're going to want to make sure that your pots have drainage. A lot of people, they'll put mulch on the bottom of pots and then they won't put a drainage hole because they think that having a water reserve at the bottom of the pot is a good idea. In a lot of cases it is, but it depends on the species of plants. Some plants do very well with roots that are constantly in water, and other plants don't do as well. So the other thing to keep in mind with that is that there's a very important gas exchange cycle that's happening in the soil. A lot of people know that plants breathe CO2, but what they don't know a lot of times is that the roots take in oxygen as well for their metabolism. So if the roots aren't getting oxygen, the plant's going to grow much slower. And so what you want to happen is that when you have any sort of plant, or especially in a pot, you water the plant. That water goes into the soil, takes up the space in between the granules of the soil, removing any sort of atmosphere or oxygen or gases because it's taken up by water. That water is then either sucked up by the roots or flows out through the bottom or evaporates out of the pot through heat. And as that water disappears, what happens is that then there's vacant space between the particles of the dirt again. So the atmosphere is drawn back into the soil, and basically fresh oxygen is supplied to the roots. So that cycle of moistness to drying out is actually extremely important for your plants because that's going to be drawing in the fresh oxygen to the roots every time it goes through that wet to dry cycle. So if you have a pot that is not fully drying out, that does not have a drainage hole on the bottom, you're actually preventing the full gas exchange from happening in your pot from top to bottom. So that's why you want to make sure you have good drainage. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start filling up the pots with our mix, and we're going to talk about the mix that we're using. Alright, so we're going to get started with some of the smaller plants here, and to do that we're going to mix some peat moss and perlite and fertilizer and everything in a bigger pot, and then we're going to put it into a smaller pot. So take your peat moss, so use an organic peat moss. Once you put in peat moss, add your perlite. I usually use anywhere from 60 to 70% peat moss, and then anywhere from 30 to 40% perlite. Perlite's going to do two main things, and then the third for the top layer. The two main things it's going to do is prevent compaction of your soil, and then it's also going to help retain moisture. The compaction is obviously to make sure that you have nice airy soil, like we already talked about with the gas exchange cycle. And then you can see there, lots of perlite in there. Don't be afraid. Like I said, almost add it like you're gonna add half. Just a little bit less, so 30 to 40% of what you put in peat moss wise, put in your perlite. The other thing that perlite does is, let me just give you an example here. A lot of times what I'll do is that, like I said, so I'll have our standard mix throughout the whole soil, but on top I'll put close to maybe actually 60% perlite, so that it forms almost like an artificial mulch layer on top of soil. And that does a couple things. What that does is it keeps the moisture beneath the perlite in the soil better, because you don't have direct heat and sunlight hitting the soil, so you have a thin layer of protection on top of the soil. It protects the roots so that your roots aren't exposed. And the main reason it's good at doing this is that because perlite floats. So in a pot, when you're watering it, if you're giving a lot of water and the pot starts to flood a little bit, what will happen is the perlite will just float on the surface, and then when the water goes back down, the perlite will still be evenly covering the top of your soil. So it works in a nice way like that for the mulch, and it keeps the roots covered, It helps hold in the moisture, and it also prevents, in my experience, weeds from popping up as commonly. So if you have a nice evenly covered surface on your soil layer, you're not going to have as many weeds popping up. Okay, and mulch is the same thing. This is just doing it artificially in a pot, and it's smaller, so it doesn't take as much room. So I'm going to mix this in. Now, okay, so for our soil itself, this is great. You know, you can see we got plenty of perlite in here, very fluffy. You know, this is fine. So I'm gonna take our smaller pot, okay, and give it some soil. Now the other thing is, you may be asking, how much do I fill it? So we're just going to take, you know, our plant and put it in here. See how much we got to go. And I'm going to try to plant this so that they're pretty much almost flush with the top of the pot. Just you know, maybe a 1/16 of an inch of a lip going around the top. It's very, very small. The reason for that is that basically it's about utilizing the pot space that we already have. You know, there's no point in using a certain size pot and then not filling it all the way, and then you're basically artificially making the pot smaller than it is. So, you know, especially with a small 6-inch like this and you know, a new plant that we just got from the store, we want it to definitely mature some. We don't just want to put it in there and have it stay the same size. So make sure that you fill the bottom plenty to where the top of the plant is almost coming out the top, you know, just pretty much flush with the top of the pot. And you can see it's just about right. And once you've done that, take a fertilizer, your organic fertilizer, and just give it a sprinkle. And mix that up in there. It's really important for plants to have nutrients at the bottom of the pot once the roots get there. Let me say this. It's partially about stimulating root growth. I went to one of the largest ornamental farms in Southwest Florida called American Farms, and one of the points that they made there is that when they're starting their plugs that they order from other companies, the plugs for the flowers, they'll actually give them what you could say just enough water not to die. And the point to that is that when they put them in their new pots and they have the younglings under the shade cloth and they're only giving them, you know, just enough water to survive, what happens is the plants basically think that they're dying and they extend their roots out trying to find more water. So it encourages them to colonize the pot by doing that. Put a little bit of Epsom salt. So, and another important thing to take into account with this mix is that this is pretty much an inert mix to start with. Peat moss, perlite, it has no nutrients in it. So everything that's gonna be in the soil nutrient-wise, you're gonna have to add. So starting with a really good quality, just organic fertilizer, fast-acting organic fertilizer is very important. And then, like I said, adding in some of those micronutrients like the Epsom salt. And also, this one's a calcium version of the Eco Scrap, so it has calcium in it. That's going to be really important to make sure you have healthy plants, because if you just plant them into the peat moss and perlite, they're going to turn yellow within a week because there's no nutrients. And if you don't put the micronutrient stuff in it, like the trace minerals, then you're going to have long-term issues. So you want to feed your soil and start it off with a good base to make sure you have healthy plants. So we're going to take the begonia, take it out here. Now again, this was grown by professionals, so if you notice, you know, there's root colonization throughout the whole pot, you know, all the way down to the bottom here. You know, it's holding the soil together nice and well. You know, if you're growing plants in pots at home, starting from seedlings, before you transplant them, this is what you want them to look like when you take them out. You know, you want the root mass in one clump. You don't want it to be root bound, you just want the roots to have fully colonized the pot. Okay? So we're just going to fill in around this plant, and then we'll get back to you once we're done with that. Alright, so a little detail here. Before you actually fill it in, obviously I got the hose now. And you just want to pre-moisten the bottom layer. If you're doing a much bigger pot, this is even more important, to make sure that you continually moisten the layers of soil that you fill up the bin with. I would do it usually, a big bin, I'd put 3 different layers of soil in the sense of the bottom, the middle, and then the top. And each time I'm going to give them water to make sure they're evenly hydrated, because once you put the plants in there, the water is not going to flow perfectly, evenly throughout the whole soil. So it's much easier to get an even moisture content in the beginning, and then put your plants in and fill it the rest of the way up. Also, it's going to activate that fertilizer that's at the bottom too by getting it wet. Okay, so beautiful begonia here, and we have it in our new 6-inch pot. As you can see, we have lots of perlite on top. This is going to protect the surface layer of the peat moss, and also is just going to make it look nice and clean. So now we're going to do the big pots, the pepper and the eggplant. We'll take you through that. We're going to speed it up so you guys don't have to sit through it all. And yeah, enjoy. So just remember, we're going to moisten the bottoms. We're going to fertilize throughout the mix as we build the soil. And yeah, you'll see how we go. So I think we're finished up here. Everything looks beautiful. I think it looks pretty professionally done. I'm pretty happy with it. A couple last comments, obviously depending on what you're growing in the pots, you're going to treat them differently. So, we have tomato, eggplant, and pepper here. All 3 of these are going to get a tomato cage around them. Obviously, if you're not growing in a pot, then there's in my opinion, better ways to control the growth of the plant than a tomato cage. Tomato cages are kind of restricting. They're good for pots in my opinion, and they're pretty cheap. So that's what we're going to use for these. Our kale obviously don't need anything like that. They're just going to grow on their own. They're looking beautiful. And the cilantro and begonia, those will be transplanted into pots, 12-inch pots similar that the kale are in, probably in about 3 weeks. So I just want to thank everyone for watching, and I hope you guys got some helpful tips out of this. The last comment I also want to make too, if anyone was wondering, perlite itself is actually a natural mineral. It's just a mineral that's been
air puffed into like a light stone. So it's not like an artificial plastic or anything that you're putting in your plants or in your pots. And then also for the Epsom salt, I just want to say that Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate. If you guys were wondering, that's the actual trace mineral you're adding when you put in Epsom salt, is magnesium sulfate. So yeah, I think that's everything. I just wanted to let you guys know. I hope there were some helpful tips. It's pretty simple growing in pots, and it's pretty efficient. I hope you guys have a good growing season. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll have more videos about plants to come. Thanks so much. All right, Exploration Botanicals, signing out.
Got me on your mind.